Greetings and salutations, Greek students. We continue our study of the Greek language by learning about what are called liquid verbs. Liquid verbs are verbs where the stem of the verb ends with a flowing or frictionless letter. Lambda, mu, nu, rho. These are liquid verbs. And because they end in that lambda, mu, nu, rho consonant, when the sigma comes up against those particular letters, lambda, mu, nu, rho, the sigma likes to drop out because it doesn't like the friction of ms, rs, ls. It's too much friction. So these are liquid because they're flowing. They don't like to combine these sounds. And that's, of course, becomes a problem when you have some suffixes of verbs that use the sigma, the future, the first aorist. So those so, say, salmon, those so, say, etc. endings where you have that sigma on your normal present active indicative endings, or sa, say, salmon, sadi, san, the sigma alpha endings that you have on your first aorist endings, when those come in contact with verbs that end in that lambda, mu, nu, rho consonant, the sigma drops. And so you have to be expecting that you're not going to see it. So let's look at how this actually works in practice. Again, those future suffixes, those first aorist suffixes, there's not a strict pattern. So here I point you to N. Clayton Croy's grammar on pages 131 through 33. He looks at various examples of this in the morphology. There are some typical things that happen, and so I want to talk about what typically happens with the recognition that things are slightly, not always the same. So you can see this meno, I remain. Meno, I remain, ends in that nu on the verb stem. So that nu and that sigma, the sigma just flows in, it disappears. So what happens is the sigma gets replaced with an epsilon. And so just like we saw with the contract verbs, when you have the epsilon and the omega, they contract and you get the omega with the circumflex accent. So it's meno or krino, I judge in the future, krino, and the circumflex accent over the omega. Now, if you're reading this in Greek, the only way that you're going to be able to tell the difference between a present active indicative, krino or meno, and a future is going to be looking for that circumflex accent. So this is where paying attention to accents becomes really important. Another example, egero, I raise. In the future active indicative, I will rise. You have a stem change where the iota in the egero disappears and it becomes egero. So you have a slight difference where there's actually a change to the stem of the verb, but it's a similar pattern where you see that circumflex accent over the omega. So when you see that circumflex accent over the last part of the verb suffix, that should kind of put a blinking red light in your brain of going, wait a minute, pay attention, something tricky is going on here. This isn't just a normal present active indicative verb form. There's something different is happening here. Now, when it comes to the aorist tense, typically, and again, there's not an exact pattern, but it will involve adding a iota to the verb stem and the alpha suffix without the sigma. So, for example, the verb apostello, I send, in the aorist is going to morph as follows. You're going to see apestela. So, as we would expect, the apa here from the prefix from plus stello, you're going to see change where the epsilon prefix is going to show up between the prefix and the stem. Ape, stela, and notice one of the lambdas has dropped. We don't have one of our lambdas anymore. It disappears. And instead of that lambda, we have one lambda and a iota. So apestela, apestelas, apestelen, apestelamen, apestelate, apestelon. So you see the alpha suffix, sa, se, saman, sadi, san, but instead of the sigma, which is frictionless, it's flowed into the liquid lambda, mu, nu, rho, and you still have the alpha in there, but you don't see the sigma, but it shows up in some other stem change on the verb, usually the addition of a iota. And you should be looking out, as usual with those aorists, you should be looking out for those epsilon prefixes. So if you see that epsilon prefix, you got to know, oh, I'm looking at an imperfect, I'm looking at an aorist, and then you see that epsilon prefix and an alpha, that should be a pretty good giveaway that what you're looking at is one of these aorist liquids, especially if you can know, oh, this verb ends in a lambda, a mu, a nu, or a rho. And there's other things in chapter 22 that are worth checking out. Croy talks about reciprocal pronouns. These are the of one another, to one another in the direct object, in the accusative, as well as possessive pronouns. You don't see these. I mean, they do appear in the New Testament. It's going to be more worth your time at this point to focus on learning these patterns of morphology when you get to these liquid verbs. And it's appropriate to think about learning contract verbs and liquid verbs, chapters 21 and 22 around the same time, because you see the phenomenon. Knowing how the vowels contract in contract verbs helps you when you get to liquid verbs, because you have that epsilon kind of sliding in. So this has been an introduction to the use of liquid verbs, that is, verbs whose verb stem ends in a lambda, a mu, a nu, or a rho. And when they have that sigma suffix on the first aorist or the future, that sigma is going to flow in, it's going to disappear and come up somewhere else in the verb stem or in the ending as a circumflex accent to indicate, hey, something has gone on here. So this has been an introduction to liquid verbs.